The fundamental question we must address extends beyond merely documenting what transpired, reaching toward understanding why circumstances permitted such an outcome. What factors caused Japan's preeminent fighter aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M30, piloted by some of the Navy's most experienced airmen, to prove inadequate for executing what should have constituted a standard protective assignment? The explanation lies within an intricate network of technical deficiencies, doctrinal shortcomings, and a basic misapprehension regarding how aerial combat had transformed by 1943. The mission took place merely 2 days following the completion of Operation Waigo, which marked Yamamoto's final major offensive action, with the Admiral travelling to personally commend the units that had taken part. The morning of April 17, 1943, at Rabaul's Lakunai airfield, brought uncommon tension to the 204th Naval Air Group's ready room. 6 pilots received summons for a specialized briefing that immediately distinguished this assignment from the continuous patrols and alert scrambles that had characterized their recent war experience. These selected men constituted experienced naval aviators. Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki served as a section leader possessing over 2 years of combat operations. Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita had already achieved ace status with approximately 30 aerial victories. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka, credited with 20 victories, had demonstrated tactical judgment that kept him alive through Guadalcanal's most savage air battles. Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagaya, credited with 8 confirmed kills, had earned recognition for exceptional marksmanship. Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinwe possessed a reputation for unwavering nerve under fire, while Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki, though younger than his companions, had already proven himself in combat situations. Commander Tadashi Nakajima of the 204th Air Group personally conducted the briefing. The following day, these 6 pilots would receive the extraordinary privilege of escorting Admiral Yamamoto himself during an inspection tour to Bougainville. The significance of this assignment exceeded normal parameters. Yamamoto represented far more than merely a fleet commander. He embodied the strategic mind behind Japan's naval operations, the creative force behind Pearl Harbor, and perhaps the singular Japanese leader who genuinely comprehended both Japan's capabilities and its constraints in waging war against America's industrial power. The pilots immediately grasped that this transcended routine operations, representing instead a sacred responsibility. The Admiral intended to visit bases at Balalai and Buin to personally recognize the pilots who had just concluded Operation Frango. What those Japanese pilots preparing their aircraft at Rabaul could not possibly know was that 1,600 miles distant at Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had just accomplished one of the war's most significant intelligence breakthroughs. On April 14th, several American radio intercept stations detected a Japanese naval transmission designated NTF 131755, encoded using the JN25D cipher that American codebreakers had been progressively deciphering since before the Battle of Midway. This message, directed to commanders of Base Unit 1, the 11th Air Flotilla, and the 26th Air Flotilla, contained something unprecedented in its specificity. It provided a comprehensive itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto's forthcoming inspection tour, complete with precise departure times, arrival schedules, and exact routing information. At Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the decoded message revealed Yamamoto's schedule with remarkable precision. American intelligence officers could scarcely believe their extraordinary fortune. The Japanese, with their cultural emphasis on detailed planning and punctuality, had inadvertently furnished a perfect operational blueprint for an assassination. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself needed to authorize what came next, and following consultation with Washington, the determination was made that Yamamoto must be eliminated. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, planning for Operation Vengeance commenced with a sobering mathematical assessment. The distance from Guadalcanal to the projected interception point near Bougainville measured 420 miles, representing the absolute operational limit of the P-38 Lightning's range, achievable only with auxiliary fuel tanks and flawless navigation. Major John Mitchell, commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron, worked throughout the night of April 17th with his operations staff, calculating fuel consumption rates, wind velocities, and the exact timing required to intercept Yamamoto's flight at the singular moment when success became possible. The resulting plan demonstrated audacious precision. 18 P-38s received assignment to the mission, though mechanical problems during startup would reduce the actual number to 16 aircraft. These 16 P-38s would execute a meticulously calculated route maintaining position beyond Japanese radar range and coast watcher detection, preserving complete radio silence while flying at wave-top altitude to avoid observation. The flight path consisted of 5 distinct legs, each precisely timed. Any deviation, mechanical failure, or navigational error would result in mission failure. The intercept was calculated for 0935 hours, providing the Americans exactly 15 minutes of combat time before fuel considerations would force their return toward home. The 6 Zero pilots preparing their A6M-3 Model 22 fighters at Rabaul represented the evolution of Japan's most celebrated fighter aircraft. However, by April 1943, that evolution had become a liability rather than an advantage. The Zero that astonished the world in 1940 represented a revolutionary design, a perfect synthesis of operational range, maneuverability, and firepower achieved through radical weight reduction. Every component underwent scrutiny for excess weight. The aircraft featured no armor protection for its pilot, lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, and possessed a structure built to absolute minimum strength requirements. This resulted in a fighter capable of outmaneuvering anything airborne, with operational range that seemed impossible for a carrier-based fighter. By 1943, however, the Zero's design philosophy had transformed into its fundamental weakness. The A6M3 variant these pilots would fly had attempted addressing some deficiencies. It featured a more powerful Sakae 21 engine producing 1130 horsepower, improved high-altitude performance, and marginally better diving speed. Yet the fundamental vulnerabilities persisted. The Zero still lacked pilot armor, still carried fuel in unprotected tanks that transformed the aircraft into a flying incendiary device when struck, and most critically for the impending mission, still lacked sufficient speed to catch or escape from the new generation of American fighters. The A6M-3 Model 22 achieved maximum speed of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet. The P-38 Lightning that would attack them could achieve 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, outdive it without fear of structural failure, and carried sufficient firepower to destroy a Zero with a single burst. The defensive formation the Japanese would employ reflected doctrine developed in China against inferior opposition, not the reality facing them in 1943. Standard defensive positioning placed fighters above and behind the bombers under protection, ideal for diving onto attackers approaching from above, the classic fighter attack profile. This formation possessed a fatal blind spot, however. It could not adequately protect against attackers approaching from below and behind, precisely the approach vector the Americans had planned. The Zero pilots would position themselves at approximately 6,500 feet, roughly 1,500 feet above the 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers from the 705 Air Group. Bomber number 323 carried Admiral Yamamoto, while bomber number 326 carried Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki along with other staff officers. The escort would scan the sky for threats they expected to materialize from above, while death approached from below. As the Japanese formation approached Bougainville at 0930 hours, the 6 Zero pilots maintained their vigilant observation of the sky above and ahead. Threats always materialized from these directions, diving out of the sun, utilizing altitude advantage to build speed for a single slashing attack. Lieutenant Morisaki, leading the escort, positioned his 2 sections perfectly according to established doctrine. maintaining spacing that permitted mutual support while covering the largest possible area of sky. They now flew over Bougainville's jungle, with the airfield at Balalai visible in the distance, perhaps 5 minutes from landing. The most dangerous segment of the journey appeared nearly concluded. The threat, however, did not materialize from where they expected. At 0934 hours, Mitchell's top cover flight spotted the Japanese formation exactly where predicted. 2 bombers and 6 fighters in perfect formation, completely unaware of 16 P-38s approaching from the south at treetop height. Mitchell keyed his radio for the first transmission in over 2 hours, announcing bogies at 11 o'clock high. Captain Thomas Lanphier, leading the killer flight, could scarcely believe their good fortune. The Japanese were exactly on schedule, exactly where anticipated, and completely oblivious to the danger below. The P-38s jettisoned their drop tanks and commenced their attack. What transpired next occurred with such velocity that participants would debate the exact sequence for decades. The Zero escort, scanning the sky above and the ocean horizon, failed to spot the olive-drab P-38s climbing from below until they had already reached gun range. The American fighters, painted in dark olive and grey, blended almost perfectly with the jungle backdrop, a camouflage scheme developed specifically for the Southwest Pacific that proved devastatingly effective. By the time Petty Officer Yanagiya, flying the outermost position on the formation's right side, spotted the approaching P-38s and shouted a warning, Lieutenant Rex Barber was already within 50 yards of Yamamoto's bomber with his finger on the trigger. Barber's attack demonstrated textbook precision. Approaching from the bomber's 7 o'clock position, below and behind where the tail gunner could not depress his weapon sufficiently to engage, he opened fire with all 4 50 caliber machine guns and his 20mm cannon. The concentrated firepower tore into the Betty's right engine, right wing root and fuselage. In his subsequent after-action report, Barber would describe observing the bomber's right engine begin streaming black smoke and white vapor, oil and fuel, as his shells found their mark. He continued firing as he closed, shifting his aim to the left engine, witnessing pieces of the aircraft's structure tear away. Lieutenant Morisaki reacts instantly to Yanagiya's warning, rolling his fighter inverted and pulling through a split S maneuver, diving toward the P-38S with his wingman following. They were starting from 1,500 feet above and behind the action, however, a geometry that rendered intervention impossible. The simple physics of acceleration and distance meant that even diving at full throttle, pushing their Zeros to structural limits, they could not reach the Americans before fatal damage was inflicted. Chief Petty Officer Hidaka, leading the right side section, banked hard toward Barber's P-38. The American was already pulling away from the mortally wounded bomber, however, using the Lightning's superior speed to escape before the Zeros could bring their weapons to bear. Yamamoto's bomber, mortally wounded, nosed down toward the jungle with its right engine engulfed in flames. The pilot, Warrant Officer Takeo Kotani, fought desperately to maintain control, but with one engine destroyed and control surfaces damaged, the aircraft was doomed. The Betty crashed into the jungle canopy at 0938 hours, just 4 minutes after the initial sighting of American fighters. The second bomber, carrying Vice Admiral Ugaki, attempted escaping toward the ocean, but was caught by Lieutenant Besby Holmes, who inflicted severe damage. This aircraft also crashed, though Ugaki would miraculously survive, extracted from the wreckage with serious injuries. Only Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya managed any form of retaliation. As the P-38s disengaged and turned south toward Guadalcanal, he spotted one Lightning struggling behind the others, trailing smoke from one engine. This was Lieutenant Raymond Hines' aircraft, damaged either by defensive fire from the bombers or during combat maneuvering. Yanagiya pursued the wounded Lightning, closing to gun range and firing repeated bursts from his 20mm cannon. He observed strikes on the P-38's wing and fuselage, saw fuel streaming from punctured tanks, but the rugged American fighter continued flying, its surviving engine pulling it toward home. The pursuit continued for several minutes before Yanagiya was forced to break off. He now found himself far from Bougainville, low on ammunition, and other P-38s might turn back to protect their damaged comrade. He turned back toward Balale airfield, where the other 5 Zero pilots had already landed, their aircraft undamaged, but their mission a catastrophic failure. Heinz P-38 would never reach Guadalcanal. He disappeared over the ocean, representing the only American loss of the mission. This single victory could not alter the fundamental reality, however. The Imperial Japanese Navy's most important leader was dead, killed while under the protection of 6 of the 204th Air Group's experienced fighters. The failure of the Zero escort on April 18, 1943, cannot be understood without examining the fundamental technological mismatch that had developed by this stage of the Pacific War. The A6M0, revolutionary in 1940, was by 1943 operating on borrowed time against increasingly superior American aircraft. The very design philosophy that made the Zero dominant early in the war, radical weight reduction to achieve superior range and maneuverability, had become a fatal weakness against opponents who had learned to exploit its limitations. The Zero's lack of armor protection meant that even glancing hits could kill or incapacitate the pilot. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks turned the aircraft into a flying incendiary bomb when struck by incendiary rounds. Most critically for the Yamamoto mission, the Zero's maximum speed of 388 miles per hour and poor high-speed handling characteristics meant it could neither catch nor escape from the new generation of American fighters. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines producing a combined 2,800 horsepower compared to the Zero's single 1,130 horsepower engine, could dictate the terms of any engagement, choosing when to attack and when to disengage at will. The defensive formation employed by the Zero escort reflected tactics developed against Chinese opponents flying obsolete aircraft in the late 1930s. The positioning of fighters above and behind the bombers they protected made perfect sense when the primary threat was other fighters diving from altitude to attack. This formation allowed the escorts to maintain energy advantage while keeping visual contact with their charges. By 1943, however, American tactics had evolved far beyond the simple diving attacks of the war's early months. The American adoption of boom and zoom technique, using superior speed to make single high-speed passes rather than engaging in turning dogfights, rendered traditional Japanese defensive formations obsolete. The P-38s attacking from below could use their speed advantage to strike before the Zeros could react, then escape before the Japanese fighters could bring their superior maneuverability to bear. The Japanese had no effective counter to this tactic with the Zero, as the aircraft simply lacked the speed to pursue or escape from hit-and-run attacks. Perhaps the most damaging failure was the complete lack of awareness that American forces had broken Japanese naval codes. The detailed itinerary broadcast 4 days before Yamamoto's flight might as well have been sent directly to Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. The Japanese confidence in their code security was so complete that they never considered the possibility that the Americans might be reading their most secret communications. This overconfidence extended to the planning of Yamamoto's flight. No diversionary measures, no last-minute route changes, no additional security precautions, despite flying the Navy's most important leader through an active war zone just 2 days after the conclusion of Operation One Go. The 6 Zero pilots landed at Balalai airfield in shocked silence. There was no immediate blame, no accusations of cowardice or incompetence. Everyone understood that they faced an ambush prepared with intelligence they could not have anticipated. The weight of failure was crushing, however. They were selected for the highest honor imaginable, protecting Admiral Yamamoto, and they failed. In the rigid hierarchy of Japanese military culture, where responsibility and shame are collective rather than individual, all 6 pilots understood that their lives were defined by this single catastrophic failure. At Rabaul, news of Yamamoto's death spread through the naval air groups like a physical blow. The Admiral was more than a commander. He was the embodiment of Japanese naval power, the one leader who truly understood both Japan's potential and its limitations. His death represented not just a tactical loss, but a psychological catastrophe. Morale, already battered by months of attrition in the Solomons, plummeted further. The Japanese High Command immediately classified all details of Yamamoto's death as top secret. When the Japanese public was finally informed on May 21, 1943, they were told only that the Admiral died while directing operations at the front. On June 5, 1943, Japan held a state funeral for Admiral Yamamoto, an honor reserved for the nation's greatest heroes. The ceremony in Tokyo was attended by the Emperor himself, and the entire nation observed a moment of silence. For the 6-0 pilots at Rabaul, the funeral represented a formal acknowledgement of their failure. 2 days after the funeral, on June 7th, the Japanese launched a massive air offensive against American positions in the Solomons, specifically targeting the Russell Islands. The mission involved 81 Zeros, 12 carrying firebombs with the rest providing escort from the 204th Air Group. During this June 7th raid, 2 of the Yamamoto escort pilots met their end. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka was shot down and killed during the 90-minute battle that saw 23 to 24 Japanese aircraft lost against approximately 50 Allied fighters. Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki also died in the same engagement. Both pilots flew Zeros armed with firebombs under their wings, pressing their attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire. Their deaths marked the beginning of what would become a pattern, the Yamamoto escorts seeking redemption through combat. During the same June 7th raid, Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya's war took a different turn. After completing his bombing run on Russell Island, 2 F-4F Wildcats caught his Zero in a climbing turn. Despite desperate evasive maneuvers, American .50 caliber rounds smashed into his cockpit. One bullet struck his right hand as it gripped the control stick, destroying it almost completely. Only his small finger remained attached. Another round tore through his right leg, severing arteries and filling his flight boot with blood. Somehow, Yanagiya maintained consciousness and control of his aircraft using only his left hand, fighting against shock and blood loss, repeatedly shouting to keep himself awake. He managed to fly his crippled Zero to the Japanese base at Munda. Unable to lower his landing gear with his destroyed right hand, he belly landed on the coral runway. Japanese Marines pulled him from the cockpit more dead than alive, immediately amputating what remained of his right hand. Against all odds, he survived and was evacuated to Japan, his war over, but his life preserved. On June 16, 1943, Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki, the escort flight leader, was killed while attacking Allied transports off Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. He died alongside Squadron Leader Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano during another raid against American shipping. Morisaki's death, coming just 9 days after Hidaka and Okazaki, left only 2 of the original 6 escorts still flying. On July 1, 1943, Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinwe went missing in action during an escort mission for dive bombers attacking the Allied anchorage at Rendova Island. He was never seen again, his fate unknown. With Tsujinwe's disappearance, only one member of the original escort remained in combat, Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita. Shoichi Sugita, already credited with approximately 30 victories when Yamamoto died, chose a different interpretation of redemption. Rather than seeking immediate death like his comrades, he decided that destroying American aircraft represented better atonement than a single glorious death. Throughout the summer of 1943, Sugita continued adding to his score in the skies over the Solomon Islands. By August, he had raised his tally to approximately 40 victories, becoming the leading ace in the Solomon Islands campaign. In August 1943, Sugita's first close call with death came when his Zero was caught by American fighters while attacking bombers. His aircraft was hit in the engine and caught fire. In an act that most Japanese pilots would consider shameful, Sugita bailed out of his burning fighter, parachuting down into Japanese-held territory with severe burns. After treatment, he was evacuated to Japan for recovery, temporarily ending his combat career. By March 1944, after 7 months of recovery, Sugita returned to combat as a petty officer second class with the 263rd Air Group in Guam. The Pacific War had shifted dramatically in his absence. The Americans had seized the Marshall Islands, neutralized Truk, and were preparing to assault the Marianas. In June 1944, his unit merged with the 201st Air Group in the Philippines, which was reorganized as the first official kamikaze unit under Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. Sugita refused kamikaze missions and was ordered back to Japan. In June 1944, Sugita participated in what the Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the aerial component of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19th, Japanese naval aviation launched its largest carrier operation since Midway. The result was catastrophic. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft. Sugita survived when his unit, the 263rd Air Group, was essentially annihilated. 6 aircraft attempted to escape to Guam, but were ambushed by F-6F Hellcats. 5 were shot down immediately. Sugita's Zero, hit repeatedly with navigation equipment destroyed, somehow made it to a Japanese base on Rota, the sole survivor of his entire unit. In January 1945, now a chief petty officer, Sugita joined the elite 301st Fighter Squadron of the 343rd Naval Air Group at Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu. By this time, he had accumulated 70 officially credited victories. On April 15, 1945, almost exactly 2 years after Yamamoto's death, American carrier aircraft attacked Kanoya. F-6F Hellcats from USS Independence and USS Randolph caught the 343rd Air Group during takeoff. Sugita's Kawanishi N-1K-2J Shiden-Kai fighter was hit just as it became airborne, crashing just beyond the runway. He died instantly at age 26, having survived longer than any other combat pilot from the Yamamoto escort, but never achieving the redemption he sought. In Japan, Kenji Yanagiya underwent a long recovery from his June 7, 1943 wounds. The amputation of his right hand ended any possibility of returning to combat. Promoted to warrant officer and assigned as an instructor at Kasumigara Naval Air Station, he trained new pilots for the remainder of the war. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Yanagiya was one of approximately 5,000 surviving Japanese naval aviators from the more than 25,000 who served during the war. After the war, Yanagiya returned to Tokyo and found work in a small trading company. For nearly 3 decades, he told no one about his role in the Yamamoto mission. The burden of being the sole survivor remained a private shame he could not share. In the mid-1970s, Japanese aviation historian Akira Yoshimura, researching a book about the Yamamoto mission, discovered through investigation that one escort pilot survived the war. He tracked down Yanagiya, now in his 50s, working in Tokyo. Through multiple interviews, Yanagiya's story emerged for the first time. The selection for the mission, the pride of being chosen, the formation over Bougainville, the devastating speed of the American attack, the impossible physics of intervention. Yanagiya provided the first Japanese perspective on the mission's failure. He described how the P-38s appeared from an unexpected angle at an unexpected time, how the Zero escort was positioned according to doctrine that proved inadequate, how the American fighters were faster and executed their attack with perfect timing. He emphasized that it was nearly impossible to protect 2 bombers from 16 P-38s with only 6 Zero fighters. On April 15th through 17th, 1988, the National Museum of the Pacific War, Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, organized a symposium commemorating the 45th anniversary of Operation Vengeance. 8 surviving American pilots attended, and through Japanese contacts, they extended an invitation to Yanagiya. He accepted, making his first trip to America at age 68. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Deseret News explicitly identified the lone Japanese attending the meeting as former Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya. During the symposium, Yanagiya met mission leader John Mitchell and presented him with a small handheld compass. He shook hands with Rex Barber and the other American pilots. An official oral history interview was recorded on April 15, 1988, now archived through the portal to Texas history. Video documentation captures panel discussions featuring Yanagiya alongside American pilots including Frank Holmes, Louis Kittle, Jack Jacobson, Douglas Canning, and Roger Ames. Yanagiya lived another 20 years after the symposium, giving interviews and appearing in documentaries. He maintained that the failure to protect Yamamoto was inevitable given the circumstances: obsolescent aircraft, outdated doctrine, and facing an enemy who knew exactly when and where to strike. On February 29, 2008, Kenji Yanagiya died at age 88, the last witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes. The failure to protect Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, was ultimately a failure of technology and intelligence rather than courage or skill. The Zero, revolutionary in 1940, was dangerously obsolescent by 1943. Its lack of armour, self-sealing fuel tanks, and most critically competitive speed made it incapable of countering American boom and zoom tactics. The P-38 Lightning could engage and disengage at will, dictating the terms of combat in a way that negated the Zero's advantages in manoeuvrability. The A6M3, Model 22's maximum speed of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet was significantly slower than the P-38's 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Lightning's twin Allison engines produced combined horsepower that dwarfed the Zero's single power plant. The P-38 could climb 1,650 feet per minute faster than the Zero and maintained superior performance above 20,000 feet thanks to its turbo superchargers. The breaking of the JN-25D cipher represents one of the greatest intelligence successes in military history. The detailed itinerary broadcast by the Japanese gave the Americans everything needed for the interception. The message, sent to multiple commands as part of post-Operation I-Go coordination, specified exact times and locations. This intelligence coup was magnified by Japanese overconfidence in their code security and failure to implement basic operational security measures. The Japanese Navy's inability to conceive that their codes might be compromised persisted even after Yamamoto's death. While some officers suspected the Americans had been warned, the Navy leadership rejected the possibility that JN-25D had been broken. This willful blindness allowed American codebreakers to continue reading Japanese communications for months afterward. The positioning of the escort reflected tactics developed against inferior Chinese opposition in the late 1930s. The assumption that attacks would come from above, the spacing that prevented mutual support, and the altitude differential that made rapid intervention impossible all contributed to the failure. The 6 Zero pilots were positioned in 2 V formations of 3 aircraft each at approximately 6,500 feet, 1,500 feet above and behind the 2 Betty bombers. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized individual skill over coordinated tactics. While American pilots trained extensively in mutual support techniques like the Thatch weave, Japanese pilots were expected to prevail through superior airmanship. This worked when Japanese pilots held qualitative edge in both aircraft and experience. By 1943, however, American pilots were increasingly well-trained and flying superior aircraft. For the 6 Zero pilots who flew escort on April 18, 1943, the failure defined the remainder of their lives. Within 3 months, 4 were dead. Hidaka and Okazaki on June 7th, Morisaki on June 16th, and Tsujinue missing on July 1st. Shoichi Sugita survived until April 15, 1945, accumulating 70 official victories before dying during a takeoff scramble at Kanoya. Only Kenji Yanagiya survived the war, living with the burden of failure until 2008. The 204th Air Group, from which all 6 escorts came, suffered severe losses throughout 1943. The unit had been formed on November 1, 1942, by renaming the 6th Air Group and operated from Rabaul during the Solomon Islands campaign. By war's end, few of its original pilots survived. Yamamoto's death dealt a psychological blow to Japan from which it never recovered. He was not merely a fleet commander, but the intellectual architect of Japanese naval strategy. His understanding of American industrial capacity, his warnings about protracted war, and his ability to conceive operations like Pearl Harbor made him irreplaceable. His successor, Admiral Minichi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's vision and charisma. For the Americans, the successful assassination validated their intelligence capabilities and demonstrated their growing ability to execute complex, long-range operations. The mission became a template for similar operations throughout the Pacific War. 18 P-38s were initially assigned to Operation Vengeance, though only 16 actually flew after 2 developed mechanical problems during startup. The failure to protect Yamamoto was not a failure of the 6 escort pilots, but a failure of the entire Japanese military system by 1943. It represents the moment when individual courage and skill could no longer compensate for technological and intelligence disadvantages. The Zero pilots did everything their training and doctrine prescribed, but their training and doctrine were fatally flawed. Could the Zero escort have saved Yamamoto if positioned differently? The harsh answer is probably not. Even if they had spotted the P-38 seconds earlier, even if positioned lower, the speed and firepower advantage of the American fighters was decisive. The P-38s needed only seconds to destroy the unarmoured Betty bombers. The Zeros might have made the attack more costly, but they could not have prevented it. The story of why the Japanese pilots failed to protect Admiral Yamamoto is thus not merely a tale of a single mission gone wrong, but a microcosm of Japan's larger defeat in the Pacific War. It demonstrates how technological superiority, intelligence advantage, and tactical innovation can overwhelm traditional military virtues like courage, skill, and dedication. The 6 Zero pilots represented the finest of Japanese naval aviation. But by April 1943, excellence was no longer sufficient. The mission occurred at the culmination of Operation One Go, Yamamoto's last offensive that claimed to have sunk 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 transports while destroying 175 Allied aircraft. Actual Allied losses were approximately 25 aircraft and several ships. The operation involved concentrating 350 aircraft, including carrier planes from Zuikaku, Zuiho, Junyo, and Hio for strikes between April 1st and 16th, 1943. Japanese losses totaled 55 aircraft. Yamamoto was flying to congratulate the units that participated in Operation Waigo when American intelligence, having broken the JN-25D code, learned of his exact itinerary. The precision of American planning, 16 P-38s navigating 420 miles in radio silence to arrive at exactly 0935 hours, represents the evolution of American capabilities by 1943. The wreckage of Betty Bomber No. 323 remains in the Bougainville jungle, a memorial to Admiral Yamamoto and his staff. The 6 Zero pilots who failed to protect him are remembered primarily through Yanagiya's testimony. Their failure deserves consideration, for it encapsulates the tragedy of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War. Skilled warriors undone by technological inferiority, doctrinal rigidity, and intelligence failures. Kenji Yanagiya died on February 29, 2008, at age 88, the last witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes. With his passing, the story of the Yamamoto escort passed from living memory into history. The lessons remain relevant, however. The danger of technological complacency, the importance of intelligence security, the need for doctrine to evolve with circumstances, and ultimately the limits of human courage in the face of systematic disadvantage. The 6-0 pilots who flew on April 18, 1943, were not failures. They were men asked to accomplish the impossible, and their inability to achieve it marked not their inadequacy, but the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. They flew obsolescent aircraft, followed outdated doctrine, and faced an enemy who knew exactly when and where to strike. Their story represents one of the Pacific War's most poignant tragedies. Warriors defeated not by lack of courage, but by the changing nature of war itself.